Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of Indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Say hello and welcome to the program. Look, today I'm going to talk about something in a way that I'm doing next week. I've been asked to speak at the Poor People's Campaign's event. It's a town hall event, Zoom town hall event, and I'm going to be talking about inequality and poverty as it relates to Native people. The Poor People's Campaign has been around for a long time. Martin Luther King actually began this campaign, and so in his lifetime, he had envisioned how strong a campaign had to be had to lift people out of poverty, and how that, much in the same way other people are suggesting that classism is the most dangerous part of racism, or perhaps more significant than racism. But again, this is something that has been picked up fairly recently, and over the last few years, Reverend Barber is one of the guys who is a big player in this Poor People's Campaign. But Native people, we kind of got left out of the mix in much of this conversation up until fairly recently. Now there's an indigenous component to the Poor People's Campaign. I participated in some of it already, done a couple of events, live events, and then we did a Zoom event last year. So, but I figured this is a good opportunity for me to talk about. So anyway, this event is on October 10th. It's next Saturday, but this gives me an opportunity to talk about some of these issues. And look, as Native people, I don't think we fully understand sometimes just what we're up against, and why is it that our lifestyles are challenged so much more than other people's. And so I want to kind of go through what some of the hurdles are, what Native people are somewhat familiar with, but certainly non-Native people are not familiar with at all. Look, from the outside, everybody thinks that Native people just have it made. We have all these rights and privileges. We don't pay taxes. We don't do this. Many Native territories have casinos, so Native people must be just rich. And of course, that's anything but true. Yes, there are some taxes we push back against paying, and our view is that the taxes don't apply to us, but we still get taxed on many levels. We still get taxed. Federal income tax is one of those things that we are in a constant battle with. New York State recognizes that our income isn't taxable, but they're still trying to impose. New York State still believes that they have the right to collect tax on sales that we make on our territory to non-natives or to non-enrolled members, as they put it. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of battle over that stuff, and which kind of leads to some of the impoverished situations that we face. And of course, the inequality or outright racism leads to many of these conflicts. But let me go through a little of it. I mean, some of it is just basic banking. We don't have the same financial tools available to us as Native people. Now, some are going to say, well, sure we do. We can get a checking account. I'm talking about lending. You have to understand the main purpose of a bank is to issue loans, not just savings and loans banks, but they are supposed to offer financial instruments, not just the convenience of a checking account. And for the most part, we can't go to the bank and borrow money unless we have money in their bank. We can borrow against our own money. We can't borrow money for let's say like a home or a business, because we can't give the land as collateral, the fixed assets, the real estate assets as collateral, and so we can't get a home mortgage. We can't build a home on our territories with a bank loan. We have mortgage programs run by the Native governments, so to speak. We can borrow money to get a trailer, a mobile home, and the reason we can do that is because they can just load up bring a truck by and load it up and pull it out of here. So. But as far as building a permanent home, a high quality home with a fixed home, we can't do that unless we can pay for it out of our own pockets or have a quote unquote nation program for that. And of course, they're always going to be limited. There's only so many houses that can be built by a native government, and even with the assistance of programs that have other hoops to jump through, like HUD and that kind of thing, there's a limitation. Look, in the vast majority of homes in the United States, they are built privately. They're individual mortgages for those homes. They aren't government programs, and so to suggest that could be the solution to our housing problems is. Without us being able to borrow money to build homes, we're never going to have an adequate supply of homes for the vast majority of our people. Now, keep in mind, while I dispute some of the numbers associated with the census that are performed every decade, census information suggests that 70% of the Native population does not live on Native territory. Well, I don't know if it's that high, but if it is that high, or whatever level it is, part of that is that we simply don't have places for people to live. We don't have apartment complexes. We don't have enough residential areas that have been built out by the nations that that have the resources to do some of this stuff. So we simply don't have the many people. Their first homes are off territory. If you're young, you don't necessarily have a place to move into when it's time to leave the nest. So you get an apartment in town, or in the surrounding towns, and that just leads to this exodus of our population from our territories. But that is directly related to things like financing. And how much that we can borrow. Now, that same problem with housing and financing housing relates to our economic development. We can't borrow money to build a business. We can't borrow money to cover overhead. Those kinds of loans that a standard business off territory has, they are collateralizing. They're backing those loans and those. Credit lines and that kind of stuff with their physical business. We can't do all that stuff. Now, having said that, I don't want to do that. I'm not suggesting that we need to get banks or change our circumstances so we can put up our land for collateral. Frankly, that is how a lot of native lands were lost in earlier days. Really shady kinds of loans. I mean, one of the classic cases that for the Oneidas was a case where the last 32-acre parcel of land on what was considered the Oneida Reservation in just south of what is called Oneida, New York, was the Hanyos tract. And the Boylans, who there was a loan. Put it this way: there was a loan associated, and the person who lent the money was trying to take possession of the property against that loan, and that turned into a case which kind of changed even how the state viewed its role in it was called the Boylan case. That's where the name came from, and I'm not sure if Boylan was the lender or not, but it actually made New York State reassess their role in how they interacted with Native issues. And and this was in the just before 1920, and it made the state say, look, this is obviously a federal issue, and we shouldn't be involved in administering judgments on Native cases, nor should they be paying treaty payments and that kind of stuff. So, but again, a lot of lands were lost this way. I mean, and in fact, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to Henry Harrison, who was the governor, Thomas Jefferson was the president at the time. I think this is like 1803 or something along those lines. In a letter to Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the Indiana Territory, was encouraging the shop owners, the ones who would, the classic general store, telling them, look, keep your prices low. Sell as much as you can to the Native people who are willing to buy. And if they don't have money, give them credit lines. Get them in debt. And if you get them into debt, they'll lop off that debt with their land. And then we'll eventually, reach our final consolidation, is what Jefferson called it. So there was actually a plan to use credit and lending to take our lands. That was one of, Thomas Jefferson's brainchilds. I mean, so this idea of financing and losing land is something that, I mean, for the most part, look, a bank takes your land as collateral, not with the intent that they're going to take your land. It's about security. But there have been, in our history with lenders, it was always like, yeah, we're going to give you debt, and we're going to run you into debt. In fact, that history is fairly recent. If you look at someplace like Foxwood Casino, the Nantucket Pequots, there was so much money being thrown at them that they ran into huge debt, and finally had to use Chapter 11 bankruptcy laws to reorganize themselves, because lenders, they didn't care whether they really had the money to pay them. They wanted to they were all trying to throw money at them to do large building expanses. So, but, and of course, trust me, they got paid. But the way financing works today is very, very difficult. Even like in Foxwoods, they actually had to use their cash flow for credit. They couldn't put the land up. The banks can't foreclose on property. And so that leads to a bit of a problem, when it comes to us developing our homes, our businesses, and that kind of stuff. Now, because banking, there's other challenges there too, and among those challenges were the businesses that we're doing, and how the state or federal government views those businesses. When they criminalize our business, like tobacco, for instance, or any businesses that where we've taken advantage of our regulatory advantages by not allowing the state to impose their taxation, the state creates this grayness in those businesses and criminalizes it. They look, as I sit here today, the smoke shops here on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, as far as the state's concerned, every one of those smoke shops has contraband on their shelves, simply because they don't have a New York State stamp on them. Now, they're not enforcing or trying to seize that product, at least not from our territories. They'll pull over a truck if they see one. If they can locate a truck that's carrying a native tobacco brand from a native territory to another native. One of my sponsors is, facing millions of dollars worth of fines associated with that. So, look, this is the battle we're always in. So, having said that, what it does is it puts us in a difficult spot when we want to use banking even as a means to manage our financing. So if we can't trust putting our money in a bank because at any given time the state could say, well, that's an illegal enterprise and we're going to seize that. It's not like the banks warn you. Might want to clear out your account. The state's taking it, because that's actually has happened. The merchant accounts that we're using, especially for mail order tobaccos, when that was something before the states, did everything they could to outlaw that. Our merchant accounts associated with credit card processing, some of those got seized. They got seized, in a larger net that they claim was thrown out there because of terrorism financing and money laundering and these kinds of things. And some of those, some of our native business people had to fight like hell to get that money back. Some of them didn't get it back. So trusting our banking relationship as native people is difficult, because we do operate at a certain level, cash-based businesses, because for us, they are more secure. Now, they become problematic on some levels because moving money around and that kind of stuff is difficult. Paying for, how do you pay vendors if you can't use a bank? And you can, but now you're transporting large sums of money to pay for your gas shipment or your tobacco. So it has placed us in a precarious situation, which really limits our ability to develop businesses. So that's another example of how inequality, racism, has contributed to some of our difficulties in terms of developing economically. The other issue is that we don't have the same mechanisms, and again, this isn't a complaint, it's simply just a matter of fact, that the outside has for public finance. How do the nations get their resources? How do they fill their coffers? Well, they're not taxing our people. We not only fight the outside for taxes, we don't embrace the idea of taxing our own people. And in fact, taxation is a capitalism-based system where the governments actually hinder capitalism by imposing taxes on whether it's the sale or whether it's income, whatever. They have all these different means. Look, you get taxed, and people don't even realize it. There's excise taxes, there's sales tax, there's income tax, there's property tax, there's inheritance tax. There's all kinds of taxes that the state and federal governments have. We don't allow any of those on our territories for the most part. Although I will say the feds are still pushing their income tax on us. Now, excise tax is another issue. Tobacco, we can't even get tobacco products onto our territories without the excise tax being imposed upon that product. Even the product that we manufacture ourselves, that becomes suspect at the ATF level, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms level, if we don't pay the federal excise tax, even on products that we manufacture ourselves. And for the most part, most manufacturers do that. They may not pay state or provincial taxes, but for the most part, they're going to pay the federal taxes to avoid that gets wrapped up even to native producers in the cost of doing business. So, so we don't have the same public finance. I mean, that's money that's coming out of our territories, even as we argue about what taxes, we're going to allow the outside to tax us. But inside, we don't tax. There have been some mechanisms placed in where people, whether it's voluntary compliance or whether it's you pay a fee or whatever else, we could argue whether there's a certain amount of tax that goes that some nations are charging in their tobacco sales or their fuel sales. But there's usually massaged language, so they don't actually use that word. But but we don't. It's not generating the kind of significant income that's going to finance a native government. So how do they get financed? Well, they get financed by doing casinos, by them being in business themselves. I mean, here in Seneca Territory, the Seneca Nation has enterprises that include their own gas stations, convenience stores, tobacco shops. But of course, their big breadwinner are the gaming enterprises. So that's how public finance is created, and the difficulty with that is you create a certain level of competition against nation-owned businesses and the private sector. And that's never been that smooth a relationship. Instead of there being a fairly good cooperation between the two, even as native business people got into politics, there's always been this rift. And part of it is traditionally, when you look out at the have and the have-nots in most native territories, it was the tribal business people, the tribal government people who were usually sitting pretty. They got the nicer houses, they had the bigger incomes, those were the most lucrative jobs on our territories. And then when the private sector developed, you had the tobacco business folks who were making money. So the have and have-nots meant that if you weren't either working in the government or owning a smoke shop, then you probably had your own suspicion about both. And so the anti-business sentiment grew in a lot of native territories. And it was considered somewhat rogue because obviously we were fighting back against the state and federal government's authority over us. And it put people who were not necessarily embracing these native businesses in kind of a tough spot. They were not they were not necessarily keen on millionaires being created on their territories because they viewed their sovereignty was being exploited personally, individually, and they weren't getting anything out of it. So this resentment, is part of what becomes the kind of the crab in a bucket, scenario where people don't want to see other people succeed. And in defense of those people who see this wealth accumulating, the business owners certainly were not that great about sharing that wealth. And, so this is what contributes to all of that. Now, where this becomes the biggest problem when it comes to how do you sustain yourself is simple employment rates. Look, native territories have a higher level of unemployment than any other place in the United States and Canada. Our unemployment levels, and look, what they call an unemployment rate, which is really based on the people who just notified the Department of Labor that they're looking for work or that they're filing for unemployment benefits or something like that doesn't even scratch the surface. I would argue that the employment rate on our territories is many times the employment, or let me I'll use a more familiar phrase. The unemployment rate is probably higher than 50% on most native territories. I mean, most people are not working. So the people who are in the minority. And so, look, we're not just talking about teenagers not working here. There are many people who are unemployed on our territories. Now, because there is some nation assistance that oftentimes is offered because of, whether it's from gaming, revenue or whatever, even people who are unemployed do have some income. But this is, again, the poverty levels are in excess of 30%. 30% of the people on our territories are living below the poverty line, even in territories that have gaming. Now, that may not make sense. And we could argue that the scale measuring that poverty line is not adjusted for the fact that perhaps our lifestyles don't require the same income off there because we're not paying some of those, property taxes, and our housing is cheaper and that kind of stuff. in my mind, and I'll talk about this more in the second half of the show, among the things that we need to do to fix our economic situation is lower what we regard that poverty level by improving the quality of life that we can live with less income. I think the idea that we're only going to drive everything towards the bottom line on our tax forms, on our income statements, I think we've got to achieve a higher quality of life that is less dependent on the outside economies. But let me keep going. So we not only have, again, household income that places 30% of our populations living below the poverty line. We also have a lack of resources on our territories from a product and services standpoint. We don't have grocery stores. We have smoke shops and convenience stores, and look, we patronize those too. I mean, this isn't just outside patronage. So when we get a dollar in our community, we spend it locally as much as we can. But for the most part, we're off to Walmart or Costco or Target or the local grocery stores in the towns nearby. We don't have grocery stores on our territories. We don't have many of the other products and services. We pay a cell phone bill to an outside vendor. Our power is coming from National Grid. Our gas is coming from National Fuel. I mean, this is what we face, right? We, again, whether it's our cell phone or whether it's, our cable television. No, I'll take it back. We don't have cable television. Our direct TV or dish network, because we don't have fiber optic cables to our territory. Another thing that affects our development here. So all of these services are outside services. We don't have companies necessarily that can provide us, in an adequate level anyway, the products and services we need. So that means the money that does come into our territories leaves right away. Again, as this thing is, as economies are assessed, the general rule of thumb is that when a dollar comes into a community, if it doesn't change hands at a minimum 3 times, but in a best case scenario, 5 to 8 times, if a dollar doesn't change hands that many times in the community, then it doesn't have a net benefit for the community, because that money can come in and go out as soon as the community doesn't benefit from it. An individual may be able to make that income. So if they have a job off territory, they bring that money in, or if they have a business, that money comes in. If they have to spend it immediately outside, then we haven't truly achieved the economic benefit, which is directly related to the poverty that exists on native territories. So we're not creating that same level of economic benefit, even from the incomes that we do have, whether it's outside employment or whether it's businesses that do develop on our territories. And again, frankly, we may patronize the stores that we have here, but if we're spending a great deal of our income, disposable or otherwise, in our own gaming facilities, that's not necessarily raising the quality of our life. Look, gambling is a vice, even if it is one of the ones that it becomes a means for our form of public finance. We shouldn't necessarily be spending all our money back into those systems. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour. We're going to take a break, and when I come back, I want to get into a few more of these things that are pitfalls, but I also want to talk about the things that we need to do to change them and to affect it and to improve the quality of our life. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to give a shout out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises and the good folks at Grand River Enterprises. I also want to tell people, look, if you're not subscribed to our podcast and to our YouTube channel, you might be missing some content. If you're just watching us on Facebook, or if you're just watching us on YouTube or listening to us on a podcast and not doing both, you may miss some content. So I recommend that you search for us online. You can search Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast. You can ask your smart speaker to do that, and we're on all of the most popular podcast platforms. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you are going to find not only the shows like this that we do, but our short form videos. And we do intend on doing more and more of those as we go forward. We're constantly working towards building up our equipment inventory to do more of this kind of thing. So again, look for us both as a podcast and as our YouTube videos. I also want to mention we are on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native, you can support this program. We're going to be providing exclusive content to our Patreon subscribers, and that's something we're pretty excited about. So again, keep us in mind as you're looking for where you're going to get your news and your views and that kind of stuff. I know it's easy to just fall into some of the most popular social media or cable television, but look for us. We're going to give you something a little different with each program. All right, as I was talking about, there are a lot of challenges that we have. I mean, the outside generally thinks that Native people we have all these great advantages and that we must be living large because of it. But the reality is, we experience poverty levels that higher than almost anybody. And it's far worse in some territories, and I don't need to name them because you can search it online yourself. But some places the poverty levels are extreme. I mean, it's abject poverty. Other places that where we have like here, for instance, in Seneca territory, we have an urban area that's not far from us, so we can seek employment. But if you live in a very remote territory and there's nothing for miles, or if your territory is large and there's nothing for miles, you're very limited on what you can do. But here's the thing: there are some things that we need to do better. And among the things that I've always advocated is better networking from native to native standpoint. We need a stronger relationship in native to native businesses and native to native commerce. We need to do more to recognize what one territory has and needs, and another territory has and needs. Look, this isn't anything new. I mean, when Europeans first became aware of our territories and how we operated, they were amazed at the food stores that we had developed. And it's documented. I mean, look, we didn't document this, guys. We just lived this stuff, right? But in an area that they call Ganondagan, which is set up as a cultural center in central New York, they talk about the fact that area was used to store food, and it was like a bank. It was literally like a food bank. We had so much food stored, and if territories needed, if one place had a bad year for crops and another one didn't, we had a system in place that would make sure that we didn't that we shared the wealth, literally, and the wealth in terms of nourishment and food. So the idea that today we aren't recognizing, for instance, which territories have had bigger inroads in developing, perhaps manufacturing or perhaps agriculture or whatever, and then figured out ways to conduct a more meaningful commerce. Look, I'm not saying none of us have done it. I mean, it has been done. Look, we do business with native territories in other regions, but not at the level that would bring us together and unify us in our battles against the states and against the United States. This is oftentimes, we always find that it's every man for themselves or every woman for themselves in these fights against state regulatory controls and that kind of stuff. So and that's one of the things that we really need to concentrate on. But the other thing that's related to that is we need to establish what is the native model for doing business. Look, we can recognize that the banking products aren't going to be there for us in the same way that they're there for non-native businesses. But there are other ways to generate money. There's beyond crowdsource funding and other ways. There are ways that we could pool some resources, and we need to create a better model for what is required for a successful native business. We haven't really done a full evaluation, territory to territory, on what is our position on sovereignty. How is sovereignty an asset for us? How much have we been able to expand our own controls over regulatory infringement from the outside? And so what are those regulatory advantages? What can we do in one territory more easily than in another territory? And we're not all fighting the same battles. Look, there are battles over natural resources. There are battles over location. Look, if you're in a very remote area, you may feel like that it's a much more of a challenge for you to be involved in business. But in the world that we live in, with remote sales and easier ways to communicate with each other, there's no reason that we couldn't have encouraged businesses even in the most remote areas. And we don't do enough to support our brothers and sisters who are in like very remote areas, like Alaska or the upper areas of Canada. There, in many of these places, Hawaii, for instance, where the price of goods is so expensive simply because they are not within the main population centers of the rest of frankly the rest of the world. So we should do more to create detailed models for what is going to be successful in an area, and we should understand what is the case law that's going to defend our position against the state, against a county, against the federal government, provincial governments, whatever. We need to assert that, and we need to stand together in unity more when we do that. Everybody's always talking about how Native people need to unify. Well, unity for the sake of unity isn't going to happen. We can unify around a subject. We can get 10,000 people to show up at Standing Rock to fight a pipeline with a loose definition of what fighting means, but to say that we're unified in a political sense, that's probably not very true. Look, I know even in the very charged political climate that exists in the United States and Canada, our people can be divided even if we don't vote in their elections or participate necessarily, although many advocate doing so. We can be divided along those same political lines. We don't stand together, not only individually as nations, but collectively as nations. And the reason to do that may be finances, maybe commerce. And we can find reasons within that trade and that business-to-business models that I talked about to stand together. And this also has to bring private sector and nation businesses together as well. We can't be fighting each other. Look, I know that we're in competition, but what people forget is most of the competition that we are really pitted against are not native to native competitions. I mean, look, we got smoke shops and that kind of stuff, but our real competition is the outside. And we should make sure that we don't sell ourselves short. This was always the big debate with mail order. And, mail order companies who were selling tobacco through the mail, they were driving the price down way too low. Their competition was that people could go to a local store that didn't have a native territory close by, and that's where they were getting most of the sales. So we have to have a better sense for what what the market is and where our position is in it, and how do we cooperate with other native territories when we're doing some of this stuff. So we need to understand what the value is of the asset that sovereignty and autonomy is. The other thing, and I've talked about it before, we do need to reassess where quality of life fits in with what somebody else is determining is the poverty line. Look, if it takes $1,000 a week to live comfortably in most territories, then that's probably too high a level. I mean, we should figure out ways that we can live at $400, $500, $300 a week. We should figure out ways that we can live a quality of life, not by always depending on the existing capitalist model that exists all around us. So look, do we need to bring in some dollars and some currency into our territory? Sure we do. But should we be spending 50, 60, or 60 or 70 hours a week working to only bring money into our territories? Because if you've given up that much of your life, you've already diminished the quality of life. So maybe there's things that we do where we work as a community, not for income, but that we work as a community for collective benefit, for a higher quality of life. We do those kinds of things. Now we find out, no, we don't need to make $1,000 a week. We can make, $500 a week and still live pretty comfortable lives. Look, I realize we still, even if you own your home, and even if you've gone into the tiny home class or whatever, you're probably still making a car payment. So we got to figure out, well, what is the level of financial resources we need to continue to spend outside versus what we can do inside our territories. See, the more we identify our distinction and our, I've talked about this, doing the so-called needs assessment analysis. These are the kinds of things we not only need to do a needs assessment, we need to find out what our asset assessment is. I mean, what do we have? What do we have that gives us value? And that may be our location. It may be tied to tourism at some level. It may be tied to hospitality and gaming and that kind of thing. But there may be other things that we have to offer, not just of ourselves and of our territories, but from a brain trust standpoint. I think the whole idea that we need to leave our territories to be gainfully employed is a problem. Look, we have a lot of things that work against our future, and among the things that we do to each other, we get caught up in this blood quantum debate on who's native and who's not native. Well, I'll tell you, the more that we have to go off our territories to seek employment, to seek gainful employment, the more we get pulled away from our communities. And we get pulled away from it in terms of lifestyle. We get pulled away from it in terms of influence and marketing and all of these other things, but also in relationships. Pretty soon we start looking down at our own people as something less than what we've achieved. Because why? Because we're pulling in $50,000 a year working for a non-native company off territory, or $100,000 a year, whatever the case may be. But the more we are pulled to seek our fame and fortune off territory, the more we diminish who is left on our territory, and the prospects for who's left on our territory. And this isn't just about depleting the gene pool. I'm not talking about that. But if our best and brightest are always encouraged to leave, then who's left? And I'm not trying to create a hierarchy within our communities, but if success means leaving our territories, then what does staying on our territories mean? And again, when I look back historically, modern history that is, you could always gauge the have and have-nots by the people who are involved in government, who are in charge of making decisions on a territory, and then everybody else is just the victims of those decisions. They have to live with those decisions that the power elite on a native territory are making. We've got to change that model. We've got to rethink what it's going to be. Like I said, we lower what people consider the poverty. Maybe there is no such thing as poverty in our territories, because we create environments where people don't necessarily need to have an income, a measurable income. One of the things that kind of skews the numbers is if somebody's using what is considered the poverty level of a non-native living on non-native territory, that may not necessarily apply accurately on our territories, because again, we don't pay property taxes. But we have other income that might not be claimable. The whole working off the books or getting annuity payments that are not taxable. Some of those things don't get taken into account. But I think we should create environments on as many native territories as possible, and then network those native territories, by the way, that the sole basis of determining somebody's quality of life is not an income statement. I think we have to come up with other ways. We talk about food security, not just food sovereignty, but food security. How do we provide goods and services to each other in ways that don't necessarily require that we always have to seek outside vendors for all of this stuff? I think we need to do more. We don't really support a lot of restaurants on our territories. And when I think of how many times people will be in a franchise store, a McDonald's or Tim Hortons off territory, versus what we can get on our own territories. And we can provide those services, even though those shops may have outside vendors. But again, at least that's one more stop for the dollar that we spend to get through our day. But we should do everything we can to come up with other means of give and take, not just bartering, but bartering. But how do we offer plots of land for gardening? How do we manage the housing crisis that we still have? Look, Seneca Territory, I think they have they list something close to 8,000 enrolled members. I hate that people, Seneca people that are part of the Seneca Nation. I know there's not the infrastructure to support that many households. Now, of course, that includes children. But how do we build for the future? How do we make sure that there is a place at home, in our native territories, and not just for the enrolled members? I'm not Seneca, and I live on Seneca territory. I mean, somebody could make the argument that I'm sitting on a parcel of land that a Seneca could be living at. No, I'm causing trouble for my whole life here. But the reality is there's a lot of land that's not put to use on Seneca territory, and some of that land could be put to use. There's no excuse for there not being for somebody not looking to make perhaps build apartment complexes. I've talked about different businesses that could skirt a whole lot of the problems with income tax, for instance. Look, if you built a system of tiny homes or an apartment complex and offered homes at a reasonable rent, that rent income is not taxable because it's lease income. I've talked about building storage units for the self-store industry that is flourishing off our territories. That would be non-taxable income. There are things that we could do that generate dollars and cents or can be traded off in terms of other goods and services. But we just don't think in that big picture sense. So I think we have to the two main things that we need to do individually as far as native territories go is we need to assess what is our what is the strongest assets that our communities have to offer in terms of business. And among those assets have to be, where does sovereignty fit into that? So where can we take the biggest advantage of our regulatory advantages that we have? And how can we make sure that we defend those regulatory advantages as much as possible? So I think that's one of the things. What is the business model for a native? We can't go to business school outside in a university and learn how to do business on our territories. You know, all those business schools out there say, we're preparing young people for the global economy. I say, the hell with the global economy. I mean, we need to be concentrating on the most local economy. So we not only need to do an assessment on what our needs are on our territories, but even for the non-native communities around us, we need to know what is a marketable product or service that we can provide, and provide in a way that doesn't that doesn't screw us, for one thing, but also doesn't that supports the local economy, not just the native local economy, but the regional local economy around our territories. So that's one of the things that we clearly need to do. But we also need to make sure that economy is not just a measurement of dollars and cents. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when I talk about lowering the poverty line, I'm saying let's, again, make sure that the quality of life that we choose, that we seek, that we pursue is not just bound to a certain dollar and cents, a certain income statement or income level. Let's do what we can to make the highest quality of life possible for ourselves and for our children that requires the least amount of currency and capitalism from the outside. I mean, so I think we need to really put a concentration on that. Now, the other thing we need to do, as I mentioned in the beginning, we also need to network. We need to find out from one native community to the other, how do we support each other? How do we support native to native business? How do we network? You know, look, because of what we can do electronically and online, you know, through social media, there's any number of products that we can buy and sell without necessarily having to have them produced, you know, in our own little shops. We can find the little shops elsewhere, but you know, we have to make sure that we're giving a priority to native businesses, because there's always going to be people who try to exploit it. And look, we need to hold ourselves accountable and each other accountable. We need to be responsible to our future and to our children. Among the biggest things that contributes to the poor quality of life on native territories is the sense of hopelessness, the sense that we don't have any good prospects for our future. You know, so we see our kids who just can't wait to leave. Not just leave your household, but leave the community. I mean, and look, many communities, non-native and native communities, go through the same thing. People just want to get out, but the reason most want to get out is because they don't see any real future in staying. We need to create a better and more viability for a prosperous future for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren, and that has to be done by assessing what the future is going to look like, you know, even a few years out. Look, if we're only ever catching what drops off the table of somebody else's latest scheme for making money, if we're only going to, you know, take advantage of markets that somebody else developed, we're only catching the crumbs. And we need to be a little bit more forward thinking with that. And, you know, and even as I'm saying we need to be forward thinking, we also need to remember what got us here. And we need to make sure that our future is securing our identity as Native people. I don't think we want to cease to be who we are just because we're chasing a higher quality of life. I think we need to bring forward some of the values and from some of the teachings from from generations back. We've got to bring 7 generations forward and then advance certain notions 7 generations forward from us. So this is one of the ways that we overcome the inequality. Look, I acknowledge that there's inequality, and I'm saying some of that inequality can be spun and it can be turned to our advantage. We're still going to have challenges. We're still going to have, be dogged by racism. And the way we change that narrative is not being the victims of, not allowing ourselves to be the victims of that racism, that we overcome that and we persevere over the challenges that are created by the inequalities that colonization has created. There are some opportunities there, and we need to not only flesh them out, but we need to make sure that we can locate the regions, the people, the resources to make some of those opportunities come to reality. And look, I'm not saying that we got to bail on everything we're doing now. I have no problem, continue to fight for our regulatory advantages as it relates to fuel sales and tobacco sales, and promoting our regulatory advantages as it relates to gaming. In fact, if anything, I think we need to exploit those even more. I think gaming has taken a turn where the outside is making as much money off of native gaming as we are. And we need to turn the tables on that. We need to take more control, more regulatory control, and more financial control, even over some of those businesses that depend on the outside for patronage. I don't think we're screwing anybody. I don't think we're taking advantage of anybody. I think it just makes economic sense. And frankly, all of our money that comes to our territories eventually will go off territory. And so we lift up a region at the same time. So anyway, that was my message for today. We will be back for our next show Tuesday, and I look forward to seeing you then. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.